Hello and welcome to our Zoom education session on driving and dementia. Thank you for joining us for this discussion. My name is Chris Van Leuven, and with me today are Ali Grady and Sarah Cook. We are all part of the education team here at the Alzheimer's Society of Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes, Northumberland, and Haliburton. As you already know, dementia causes many changes in the brain, which can affect a person's abilities. And over time, dementia may cause changes that affect a person's ability to safely operate a motor vehicle. It's important to recognize that a dementia diagnosis does not automatically mean that a person is incapable of driving. Some people might be capable of driving safely for some time after a diagnosis, depending on the timing of the diagnosis and how quickly the dementia progresses. In today's session, we'll explore ways to continue driving safely, and we'll also talk about some of the warning signs that it might be time to stop driving and some tips to transition to life without driving. We recognize that throughout our discussion today, there might be several questions that come up. Just in the interest of time, we ask that you please hold your questions until the end of the presentation, but feel free to jot down a question or post it in the chat box so that you don't forget to ask at the end. And then we'll go through the questions in the chat at the end of the presentation. Thank you in advance for your help with this. Let's take a look at the topics that we plan to discuss with you in our session today. First, we'll ask the question, how does dementia affect driving? How do changes in the brain impact a person's ability with dementia to drive safely? What are some of the things that we should be looking for that could be signs of unsafe driving? Next, we'll talk about the responsibilities of healthcare providers, driving, and the law. Then we'll spend some time assessing the risks that are involved with driving when a person has dementia, and looking at some considerations for having a conversation about driving retirement. After, we'll go over some strategies for supporting a retired driver and the various alternatives to driving that are helpful to explore. And finally, we're going to have some questions or some time for questions at the end. So to get started, let's talk about some of the biggest myths that exist when it comes to senior drivers and why these are important to our discussion today. We're going to explore some of these myths together and look at the realities for each of them. The first myth is that for senior drivers, rural is often safer than urban driving. Well, that's false. It might seem that driving on rural roads is a lot safer for senior drivers, but that's not always the case. In fact, in Canada, 2/3 of driver fatalities as a result of a motor vehicle crash occur in rural areas, with injuries being a lot more common in urban areas. The second myth is that higher crash rates for senior drivers are a result of changes associated with aging. And this is also false. The changes that happen in normal aging aren't responsible for the increased likelihood that seniors will be involved in a collision. Rather, health conditions like diabetes, for example, where the person might have reduced feeling in their feet, are more likely to be the culprit. The third myth is that seniors know when to stop driving, and decisions to stop driving should really be left up to the individual. Well, this is also false. Cognitive impairments can impact judgment and impede a person from recognizing the changes in their abilities. The fourth myth is that having a co-pilot in the car is an acceptable method for maintaining the mobility of cognitively impaired seniors. This is also false. There's no data or evidence indicating that a co-pilot enhances driving safety in persons with dementia or another cognitive impairment. Our fifth myth is that spouses and family members are good judges of a person's driving abilities. And this is also false. People have difficulty thinking about this objectively, especially when aspects of their own life might be impacted. These are just a handful of the common myths surrounding driving ability and seniors. And there's many reasons why people might buy into these myths. And we're going to explore those reasons later on. But first, let's talk about the skills needed to be able to drive safely. Driving requires several different skills that are important for the safety of the driver, but also for other motorists, cyclists, and pedestrians too. When we think about some of the skills necessary for safe driving, we can look to the following list. The first is quick reactions. We may need to react quickly to adapt to changing road conditions, the driving errors of other motorists, like an unsignaled lane change. We need to be able to watch for pedestrians that step out onto the road, and there's so many other examples. The next is divided attention. So being able to drive well requires the ability to divide our attention. So for example, we have to be able to both watch the traffic light and any pedestrians on the street while keeping our foot on the brake. Driving also requires good judgment, and we also need to be able to understand the rules of the road, and we need to remember them as we drive. We need to have that ability to find our desired destination. And we also need adequate hearing and eyesight so that we can drive as safely as possible. For many individuals, driving provides access to the community where they can engage in those everyday activities and occupations like shopping for groceries, getting a haircut, attending church, or meeting friends for coffee. And driving also represents freedom, independence, and mobility. Although driving really is a privilege, some people view it as their right, the right to drive. Most people in the early stages of dementia can continue to drive safely and competently. However, because of the progressive nature of dementia, it's critical to be aware of any changes in the person's driving patterns. So now that we've had a chance to talk about the skills that are required when driving, let's explore the impact that dementia can have on the ability to drive safely. It's important to emphasize here that a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that a person cannot drive. However, at some point in time, the effects of dementia will make it unsafe to drive. Let's take a look at some of the changes that might affect a person's ability to drive safely. First is memory. So as a result of changes in the brain that a person with dementia experiences, the person might have difficulty remembering things and familiar places. Decision making. The person might find it more difficult or challenging to make the decisions that might be required when driving. Attention. The person might have difficulty doing more than one thing at a time, or they might become easily distracted or not pay proper attention to their driving. Processing time or reaction time. The person's reaction time might be slowed as a result of that slower information processing in the brain due to dementia. Judgment. Due to changes in insight and self-awareness in the brain, the person might not recognize that they can no longer do tasks safely. And lastly, impulsiveness. The person may act quickly without always thinking about their actions and the potential outcome of those actions. Many of the changes or many of the effects on driving that we just shared are a result of the brain changes resulting from dementia. And it might help to take a closer look at what's going on in the brain when a person has dementia so that we can increase our understanding of how abilities are affected. So number one on our list is changes in executive functions like judgment and planning. Dementia often affects the frontal lobe of the brain early on. And when the frontal lobe of the brain starts to change, we can see a person's judgment, reasoning, and planning abilities being compromised over time. Consider how this might impact a person with dementia's ability to plan, their ability to plan out their route to a desired destination, or how their judgment may impact decision-making abilities while driving. Number two is changes in visual and spatial ability. When the parietal and occipital lobes of the brain are affected by dementia, there are changes in the person's visual abilities, their depth perception, color perception, and peripheral vision, which can often result in tunnel vision. The brain changes can also impact their spatial ability, which can have a significant impact on the person's ability to drive safely. Consider how a person with dementia might react if they were driving on a busy highway in 2 or 3 lanes of traffic, or parking in a space between 2 vehicles when their spatial ability and peripheral vision are affected. And the third one is memory changes and disorientation. When the temporal and parietal lobes of the brain are affected in dementia, we see changes in a person's short-term visual and verbal memory, as well as the impact of disorientation, which can cause confusion about time and space and forgetting where they are and where they're going and how to get there. As dementia is a progressive disease, these changes, they're not going to happen overnight or all at once. Subtle declines are more likely. This is why it's important to keep assessing and evaluating the person's driving capabilities. And over the next slides, we're going to talk about the signs of unsafe driving to watch for. If you've been driving for many years, driving may feel mostly automatic. However, as dementia progresses, it will change the person's abilities, including their level of concentration, judgment, orientation, perception, and their physical ability, which are all important and necessary skills for driving. As a result, regardless of the person's driving skill and experience before they started having symptoms, dementia will eventually put the person at a higher risk for some unsafe driving behaviors. A common question that we get asked is, how can we tell when a person might be unsafe to drive? Each person with dementia is unique, and how the disease or disorder will impact their brain health may widely differ. However, there are some signs to look for which may indicate unsafe driving. That first sign is forgetting how to locate familiar places. For example, forgetting how to get to the grocery store or a bank that they've been going to for several years. Even forgetting how to get home from where they are. The second is slow response times. Their reaction may be slower, and it may take them longer to respond to the situation at hand. They may also make unsafe or poor decisions while driving, like making a lane change without checking their blind spot or signaling. Driving at the wrong speed, whether that be too fast or too slow. Perhaps they're failing to observe the changes in speed limits, or they're driving too fast for the road conditions, or driving too slow and causing a traffic backup. Failing to observe traffic signs and signals. It might appear as if they haven't even seen a traffic sign or signal. For example, they might drive past a sign for a pedestrian crossing or they might drive through a stop sign or a red traffic light. They might be more prone to committing those traffic violations. They might become angry or confused when driving. They may be frustrated or short-tempered or confused about the traffic, other motorists, or how to get to their destination. And last on our list is hitting curbs. This might indicate that their spatial abilities are changing and they can't tell where the curbs are located. Also, poor lane control. They might be drifting between lanes or making unsafe lane changes. They may have difficulty merging with traffic. For example, they might have difficulty when they're coming up to a yield sign, getting into the correct lane of traffic or merging onto the highway. They might confuse the brake and the gas pedal. They might make an error at an intersection, not obeying stop signs or traffic signals, not yielding the right of way correctly, or pulling out in front of another motorist. Making left-hand turns in the face of oncoming traffic or with pedestrians crossing the intersection. You might notice that they're returning from a routine drive later than usual, and that could indicate that they've been driving around trying to determine how to get home. These behaviors can increase the person's risk of a collision, which can cause serious injury or death for themselves or other people. I'm now going to hand things over to Ali, and she's going to talk about assessing risk and driving safely in the early stages of dementia.
Thanks, Chris. So as was shared earlier, a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that you are not safe to drive. While your symptoms of dementia are mild, you can take steps to help you drive safely and independently for as long as possible. So here are some tips to consider to manage your driving ability in those early stages. First is to settle into a consistent routine. So stick to the same route when you drive from place to place. Figure out when you most need to drive and follow that plan. For example, do you drive to medical appointments, to shop, to meet up with friends? Are there times when someone else can drive? Second is to drive with someone that can assess your driving abilities on an ongoing basis. They might be able to notice if there are any changes in your driving abilities and spot risky behaviors that you might not be aware of. Third is to use technology to support your capacity to drive. We have so much new technology these days. One that can be helpful is using a GPS. So if you're driving by yourself, you might use a GPS to help you map out the route to your destination. Above all, living well with dementia has been shown to slow the progression of dementia. So adapting a healthy brain and lifestyle choices like challenging your brain, following a good diet, and staying physically and socially active will all help you stay in the early stages of dementia for as long as possible. How can you make sure that you're driving safely? Here's some other helpful strategies for the person living with dementia to consider so that they can make sure that they're driving safely. The first is to complete a self-assessment of your driving, and there's many of these online. One that we recommend is CAA has a simple driving assessment. And if you just type that into Google, CAA simple driving assessment, it'll come up. You could also take a driver refresher course through a local driving school. You can get an objective driving evaluation that can help you effectively assess if you have the skills to drive safely. And we'll talk a little bit about this in the following slides. You can consult a driver rehabilitation specialist in your area. So a driver rehabilitation specialist is an occupational therapist or an OT that has received specialized education in assessing a person's ability to drive. And they apply the knowledge of a person's medical conditions with its implications for driving, and they assess the cognitive, visual, perceptual, behavioral, and physical limitations that may impact a person's driving performance. You might also have a trusted care partner complete the fitness to drive screening measure, and the website is on the screen here, but we can also send that to you if it's something you're interested in. Some other tips: take short drives and keep to familiar roads. Drive at quieter times of the day, avoid rush hour, avoid those times when everybody is on the road. Be aware of the timing of medications that might affect your ability to think or see clearly. So if you find that maybe 2 hours after you take a medication, it affects your judgment, maybe that's not a good time to drive. You might consider parking at the end of a road to make finding your car easier, or if you have a smartphone, you might take a picture of where you parked so it's easier to find. And plan ahead. Know that the brain changes that are affecting you will continue to affect your ability to drive. And at some point, retirement from driving will be necessary. So back to that being assessed by a professional. So when driving becomes a concern, it can be helpful to look into the availability of a driving assessment. For example, if you decide to consult with one of these driver rehabilitation specialists, the process could include a road test conducted by someone with experience in assessing drivers with cognitive issues. If an on-road driving assessment is not available to you, enlist the help of a doctor, either your primary care specialist, your primary care physician or a specialist, to determine if and when you or the person that you're supporting should stop driving. And they can also help connect you with available support and resources. If you bring these concerns about driving to a healthcare provider, some of the things they might ask you about are driving patterns. So when and where the person drives most, any differences that have been noticed in their driving skills, any unsafe or abnormal driving behavior, traffic tickets or traffic violations, whether that's for going too slow or too fast, improper turns, failing to stop, crashes, fender benders, or near misses, instances where the person has been lost, and how comfortable they feel and their family members feel about the person's driving abilities. Let's talk a little bit more about when you talk to a healthcare provider about driving, because there's a lot of confusion around this. We're hoping to clear that up today. The first thing we want to clarify is that doctors are not the ones who ultimately determine if you are fit to drive. In Ontario, doctors and nurse practitioners are required by law to report potentially unsafe drivers to the Ministry of Transportation due to a variety of issues. That could be high-risk medical conditions, visual conditions, vision conditions, or a functional impairment that may influence a person's ability to drive safely. This includes cognitive decline due to the progression of dementia. Ontario doctors then forward their medical opinion to the Ministry of Transportation in a standardized document called a medical condition report. In this report, there's a category that describes cognitive impairment that doctors are required to review. And in that document, they must identify if the person has, and I'm quoting here, a disorder resulting in cognitive impairment that affects attention, judgment and problem solving, planning and sequencing, memory, insight, reaction time, or visuospatial perception, and results in substantial limitation of the person's ability to perform activities of daily living due to dementia. End quote. That's a pretty broad description. The Ministry of Transportation then reviews this information from the doctor on this medical condition report, and they are the ones that determine if the person should continue driving. So based on the information and the opinion provided by the doctor or nurse practitioner, the Ministry of Transportation may suspend the person's license. It's also important to acknowledge and understand that doctors are bound by law in most provinces and by their professional ethics to report medical conditions that could be a serious risk to road safety. They can also be held liable if a person in their care who has dementia is involved in a motor vehicle collision and they have not reported the person's medical condition to the provincial licensing authority. So they have to report it to the ministry if there is a concern. On the next slide, we'll look at the considerations that a healthcare provider must address in providing their medical opinion about whether the person is safe to continue driving or is no longer safe to drive. So we've broken this into 3 different sections. The first is if the doctor determines that the person is unsafe to drive, they will confirm the diagnosis of dementia and address any conditions that could be aggravating the situation. So if there's another medical condition or any medication side effects that could be at play. The doctor will ask the person to stop driving and may provide a written record to the person to help them remember. And this will be documented in the person's medical record that the doctor says the person is unsafe to drive and they should stop driving. The Ministry of Transportation will then be notified. And as we just mentioned, they're the ones who make the final decision about whether the license is suspended. The second kind of section here is if the driving risk is uncertain, if the doctor isn't sure if the person should still be driving, there are 2 potential pathways. So one is if driving safety is the only issue to assess, the doctor may refer the person to a health professional-led comprehensive on and off-road driving evaluation. Now, there is a cost associated with these tests. It's usually several $100s, and it's not usually covered by OHIP or private insurance. But it can be a really good way to evaluate where the person's at with driving. The other side is if the doctor thinks that there are additional health and safety concerns requiring further assessment and treatment, or the person truly cannot afford an on-road test, the doctor may refer the person to a local multidisciplinary dementia assessment site. And there they might have an occupational therapist do an evaluation, a neuropsychologist do an evaluation to consider if the person is safe to drive or not. If the person appears safe to drive, if the doctor determines that the person still appears safe to drive, they will probably request a follow-up in every 6 to 12 months to reassess and reevaluate. You might also be wondering about how a diagnosis of dementia impacts the person with dementia's car insurance. Now, a diagnosis of dementia does not mean automatic denial of insurance. If you've been diagnosed with dementia, talk to your doctor about the progression of your dementia and your driving abilities. Consider contacting your car insurance provider to share the information that you receive from your doctor. And your provider will then determine your car insurance coverage based on your specific situation. They can't just do it for every person because, as we said, dementia is unique for every person. Something to note, just at the bottom here, it says failure to disclose a diagnosis could impact your insurance policy. So withholding information could come back to haunt you. So it's usually best to be upfront and honest, again, after you've spoken with your healthcare provider, with your car insurance company. Knowing when to stop driving. So when your abilities have changed to the point that the risk of a collision becomes more likely, it's no longer safe for you to continue driving, and you should stop driving as soon as possible. When will you know that it's time to stop? Well, it can be difficult for anyone to assess their own abilities in a neutral way. That's why it can help to ask someone you know and trust to give you an honest and forthright opinion. This might be your spouse, a good friend, or your family doctor. Alternatively, it might be easier to hear an objective assessment from someone you don't know, like a driver rehabilitation specialist. We have one resource that might be helpful to you if this is something you're talking about. It's called Conversations About Dementia and Driving. And this is from the Alzheimer's Society. It's a brochure. On page 3, there's a questionnaire that can help to assess driving ability. So if you're wondering whether this is something, if you should stop driving or if you should continue driving, you might want to get someone you trust to fill out this questionnaire and help give you more insight into your driving ability. However, be prepared to read an assessment that you may not agree with. Having the conversation about stopping driving. So whenever it happens, the decision to stop driving won't be easy, and neither will a conversation that leads to that decision. After all, the person with dementia is losing the privilege to drive due to changes in their abilities that they can't stop. And because of this, it's totally normal for them and their family members and caregivers to feel angry, sad, frustrated, even hopeless. As well, it may add strain to the relationship between the person living with dementia and their friends and family, particularly on the primary caregiver. The primary caregiver will likely notice changes in the person's abilities before the person with dementia does, and may be the first to discuss whether the person should stop driving. On the other hand, the primary care partner may be hesitant to bring up the conversation about the person's driving ability, whether it's out of a desire to see them live independently or to avoid conflict in the relationship. Although losing the privilege of driving can be difficult, it's important to remember that it can be equally, if not more devastating, to be involved in a motor vehicle collision. A collision can result in serious disability or death for the person living with dementia, or in trauma or death or injury of others. On the next slide, there are some important questions to consider when having a respectful conversation about driving retirement and how to weigh the risks that may be involved. When it comes to driving safely, we need to consider how we assess the risk involved in driving a vehicle. As we shared earlier, decision-making ability can be affected by dementia, so it's always helpful to talk to others who are close to you to get their opinions and perspectives. Having a conversation about driving can be difficult and sometimes emotional. Here are some of the questions that you may wish to consider and discuss when having an honest and respectful conversation about driving. Number 1, what are the benefits of driving? Sometimes we lose sight of this. What advantages are there to this person continuing to drive? 2, what are the risks associated with driving? Are there risks to the person's safety and well-being? 3, who else might be affected by the person's driving? Is this person the only person that drives in your household, and so you might be affected? Or what about other people on the road? Number 4, is the risk of driving worth it? So if you look at those benefits and you look at the risks, is there a balance? Which comes out on top? And number 5, so if yes, if the risk is worth it, how can we lower that risk? What can we do to reduce the risk, knowing that we can never completely eliminate the risk that's involved? So I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to talk about some of the concerns that might come up when a person retires from driving.
Great. Thank you so much, Allie. So, as we shared earlier, both that conversation around and then the decision to stop driving won't be easy. And there may be several concerns that do come up for the person with dementia, as well as for care partners and family members when considering retirement from driving. So let's look at the emotional concerns here first. So a person may have been driving for most of their adult life. When you really think about it, right? They've probably been driving for most of their life. And so stopping driving can really feel like losing their autonomy and their independence. So they may now have to look to others to help with driving. Loss of independence can bring about feelings of sadness and grief, sometimes anger and frustration. And it can also impact the person's self-esteem and their confidence. So what does that do to that person's level of confidence? Keeping with that same idea that the person may have been driving for most of their adult life, being able to drive has probably given them an important role and also an important sense of identity. So it could be that the person is the main driver in their family, and our relationships with others. Maybe they've been driving a friend or a neighbor. And so others have had to rely on them to get to places or to make it to an important appointment, even to run errands. And stopping driving then means that important role and that sense of identity have been taken away from them. So those are the emotional concerns when considering, stopping driving. Let's look at some of the practical concerns around that retirement. So when helping the person to plan ahead for the time when they must stop driving, several questions may come up about how to get around when driving is no longer an option. And it can be useful to consider the questions that you see here on the slide. So the first is, what alternative transportation options do exist? What's available in the area where the person lives? It's important to note that availability for other transportation options may really vary depending if the person lives in a rural area or an urban setting. And we're going to talk more about alternatives to driving in just a few minutes. It's also a really good idea for the person to use these alternative forms of transportation while it's still safe for the person to drive, because this is going to help them to get used to those newer routines that they will transition to after they need to hang up the car keys for good. And as well, this may help them to accept that difficult decision to stop driving when it does eventually come. So that's a key question to consider. A second question to consider is, how do I access transportation options? And this may vary depending on a person's living situation and the transportation options that are available in their community. Your local community care is a great place to start. So that's a great tip to know there. And then another question as well. So the third question here on the slide is, how much will it cost? So cost for alternative transportation options is something that should be considered. Will those options involve accessing a community transportation service? As I just mentioned, something like community care. Might it look like, using a taxi, an Uber, even public transit? What does that look like? And the cost may vary. So it's important to look into the different availability and the types of service, because the cost will differ depending on the location from the person's destination, wherever they're trying to go. So that's key as well to consider. So now that we've had some time to acknowledge and to better understand the concerns that may come up when a person retires from driving, let's take a look at how we can effectively support a retiring driver. I think one of the most important things that we can do is to acknowledge how difficult it may be for the person to stop driving. If we put ourselves in the person's shoes, we may develop a much better understanding of the emotions and also the challenges that they could be experiencing. Validating how difficult it is for that person to give up driving helps to reassure them that we do understand and understand that it's a difficult process. Now, if the doctor has asked the person to stop driving, it's also important to respond with the same short message that the doctor believes that it's safer not to drive. And what we know is that consistent messaging is really important, and that the message may need to be repeated for that person more than once. So it may need to be shared, but being consistent in the delivery of that information can be beneficial. It can be helpful to suggest some alternatives to driving, and to assist with the planning and the coordination of these resources whenever possible. So, for example, we may need to help that person to take a taxi to the grocery store. Maybe that's once a month or once a week, or to set up an account with a taxi firm and be able to order those taxis in advance. So we may need to help them coordinate those particular resources. It may also be helpful to look into companies that offer home delivery services that would help to meet the person's needs. So for example, exploring any pharmacy or grocery home delivery services that might be available in your area. So that's great. And certainly during the pandemic, I know that those services have been well utilized. So it's great to find out what's available in your area. Do your best to encourage the person to take charge of their new transportation arrangements. That can really help them to maintain their independence and their decision-making ability. So we talked about that loss of autonomy and independence. This is a great way if we can encourage them to take charge of setting those things up. So for example, getting details and timetables of local transportation services, opening or managing their own taxi account. That's a great way to encourage that independence and autonomy. It's also really helpful to acknowledge some of the benefits to not driving. So in other words, emphasize the positive aspects of driving retirement. So for example, you might want to highlight the benefits of saving money on the cost of running and maintaining a car, and how that can add up over time, that it's less stressful for the person and being out on the roads, because we know at times that can be stressful. And even just mentioning how they may be able to enjoy the scenery as a passenger. You've always been the one to drive. Why not sit back and enjoy the scenery and enjoy being a passenger? Try to arrange outings that don't require a car. So for example, arrange to take a walk around the block, or maybe to the nearby grocery store to pick up a few items. That could be an alternative there. You may find that a letter from the doctor or the licensing authority may help the person to accept the decision. And, kind of having that tangible document to remind the person that they can no longer drive is a great reminder, and helps with that ability to support the person who is giving up driving. And reach out and consult with community resources to access and find out about other transportation options. So that's really helpful. And there's so many things that are available in the community. When a person is retiring from driving, it's always helpful to look at the alternatives to driving. And so there's a few here to consider. So we've talked about a few of them in supporting the driver, but also good to emphasize for the person themselves. So ask a family member or a friend, maybe even a close neighbor, for a ride. And if you're part of a social or a community group of some kind, maybe even part of your religious community, ask if there's anyone that could pick you up and drive you there on their way. So make those connections that way. Use public transit if it's nearby, and also if it's available to you. Think about ordering a taxi when you need to get to where you're going. That's a great option as well. And usually don't have to wait too long for that service. Take advantage of volunteer driving services. So a service that is often available in our area through community care. So we've mentioned that a few times, but volunteer drivers can be really supportive and a great service to access. Consider using a ride sharing app like Uber or Lyft. And I know that there's more of these coming out all the time. So it's great to kind of take some time to research what is available in your area. Walk instead of driving, especially if the weather is nice or coming into that time of year where the weather is much improving. And it's always a great way to stay physically active and to get some fresh air while you're doing it. So once again, I know it's been said a few times throughout this presentation, but it's really important to remember that a diagnosis of dementia does not automatically mean that you cannot drive. It is, however, just as important to know that at some point in time, the effects of dementia will make it unsafe to drive. And the key is really to start that conversation early. And of course, the Alzheimer's Society is happy to support you with that if you have any questions or you would like some assistance with having that conversation. We're always so pleased to be able to support you in that. And then we just wanted to share with you some of the resources that you may wish to consult. So to learn more about the topics that we've discussed today, feel free to visit our website, and it's listed there on the slide. There is a special section on the website that's dedicated to the topic of driving and dementia. And it contains lots of great and helpful resources, such as, the brochure that Ali mentioned, that's entitled Conversations About Dementia and Driving. And so we also have hard copies at the office, but you can also view it electronically. And we encourage you to speak to your client support coordinator or any of the education team about any resources that may be available to help you and to provide that support. So we'll also put up our information about how you can reach us. So again, we're the members of the education team, but you can also feel free to reach out at any time to your client support coordinator. And if you're not sure who that is, that's always okay. You can give the office a call or give one of us a call and we're happy to connect you. There's our information. I'll just leave it up a moment in case you're jotting it down. Okay, and so at this time, I'm going to stop recording and address any questions that you may have.